Welcome. I'm not sure if that's on, but welcome to everybody. Hello, good evening. My name is Jonathan Lawrence. I'm director of the Clough Center for the Study of Constitutional Democracy. This is the final distinguished lecture of our semester, and it is a privilege to welcome Professor Anna Grzymała-Busse to discuss the religious and medieval roots of the modern state. Before introducing Anna fully, I wanted to note for a moment that the tradition of bringing distinguished scholars like her to the Boston College campus to present their cutting-edge work and to help us think about the origins and the ingredients of constitutional democracy has thrived at the Clough Center for over 15 years. And I want to, in that context, note the untimely passing of our inaugural director, Professor Ken Hirsch, who was the center's first and very influential director. And he was a constitutional scholar, a political scientist. His influence in these disciplines has been immense. His demeanor was an inspiration for everyone. And he's dearly missed, and we will be memorializing him in various ways in the coming months. But I just wanted to recognize Ken's contributions to getting us all here and to getting the Clough Center to where it is. So to turn to today's event, Professor Grzymała-Busse is the Michelle and Kevin Douglas Professor of International Studies, and she's also a senior fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University. She has been there since 2016. She also directs the Europe Center there. Beyond Stanford, she has taught around the country at Yale, at Michigan, at Harvard, where I met her, and where she remains a senior fellow at the Center for European Studies. She has been recognized for her scholarship with induction into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and for good reason. Her fascinating and influential work focuses on the historical development of the state, including the religious, cultural, and political factors that transform states into the set of modern institutions that we know them as. She has spent her career engaging with some of the most compelling questions of contemporary political life. Her first two books were Redeeming the Communist Past, 2002, and Rebuilding Leviathan, from 2007, both with Cambridge University Press. And they established her as a leading authority on the political transformation of Eastern European societies. In these works, she has explored the unexpected regeneration and success of former communist parties after the collapse of communism. And she has wielded her expert analysis and critical insight to arrive at many thought-provoking conclusions about the role and power of parties more generally in modern states. She has expanded on these insights in Rebuilding Leviathan, where she addresses how opportunistic political parties limit their corrupt extraction of private gains from state resources when they're faced with strong political competition. In sum, she's not afraid to grapple with and find explanations for surprising or unexpected political behavior, political history. Her curiosity has naturally led her back to the origins of the very political system in which these parties and citizens operate. So most recently, in particular, she has turned her attention to the intersection of religion and politics, examining in her third book the political influence of churches in differing national contexts. That book is Nations Under God, which came out with Princeton in 2015. It has already had a very vivacious shelf life like the others. It's cited across many disciplines. Like the others, it has been recognized by professional associations of political scientists and historians, as well as regional specialists. So coming to her latest and acclaimed work that we are here to hear about and discuss with her today, Sacred Foundations, Professor Grzymała-Busse offers us a striking new interpretation of the origins of the modern state, rewriting some of the received wisdom about how the state was founded, and engaging in a close study of the Roman Catholic Church as a geopolitical actor and as an administrative legal pioneer. I'm so grateful that she's here today to expand on her work and offer insights into the complexity of the religious and cultural factors that have shaped modern state. And I just want to mention our respondent, who will be discussing her work immediately afterwards is my colleague and chair of political science here at Boston College, Professor Jerry Easter. Professor Easter has also been here forever, and has had
still middle-aged.
And he has been teaching in comparative politics with a regional focus on Russia and Eastern Europe. He's the author of Reconstructing the State, Personal Networks and Elite Identity in Soviet Russia. That's from the year 2000. He is the editor of Shaping the Economic Space of Russia, Capital, Coercion, and Post-Communist States, which came out at Cornell in 2012, as well as a couple of recent departing projects, one called The Tsarina's Lost Treasure, and the other, The Last Stand of the Raven Clan, when Russia went to war in America. So I'm looking forward to hearing from Professor Easter afterwards, but without further ado, please join me in extending a warm welcome to Professor Anna Grzymała-Busse.
Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Jonathan, for that extremely kind and generous introduction. And as the title suggests, I'll be talking about the ways in which the Catholic Church in Europe has, in the Middle Ages, has shaped sort of what we think of as European state institutions. Now, this book, which is on sale and available from Princeton University Press, makes three moves. First of all, it argues that even the most secular of state institutions, law, parliaments, taxation, can have religious roots. Secondly, it suggests that the main ways in which the church helped to build the state consisted both of a rivalry with secular rulers and of an emulation of church templates and innovations by these rulers. And as such, it offers something of a challenge to some of the canonical accounts of state formation. Now, as soon as I say state formation, this opens up the question, what are we talking about, right? So I want to make clear from the get-go that we're not talking about the Bavarian state. We're not talking about modern bureaucracies, about impersonal office, about taxation that's efficient, if unpleasant. None of that. This is a much more basic project of amassing authority over territory in a given area. So at the time, the very idea of secular rulers is almost sort of illegible, right? We're talking much more about kingship and lordship, about attempting to broadcast authority and attempting to convince your nobles to basically go along with you. And this process basically consists of building institutions that allow rulers to exercise this authority, to provide them the capacity to provide order and justice. This is at a time when the idea of providing law and order was the single thing that people expected from their rulers. This was the reason why rebellions were launched or why rulers maintained loyalty. It was all about maintaining some social order and stability. The ability to collect taxes, because in order to fund these projects, rulers needed resources. And finally, to just basically administer their kingdoms, to find out who owned what property, where people were living, to where the borders were. All of that required, all these institutions basically began this process of state formation, and we're very much a part of it. Now, I take a look at Europe, and Europe is kind of an ironic place in which to study all these processes. On the one hand, for scholars both in sociology and political science and history, it is sort of served as an archetype of state formation. This is where the canonical accounts, like Charles Tilly's and others, really sort of take as their empirical focus. But that's pretty ironic because Europe is kind of a weird place in which to study state formation. It's weird because it's incredibly fragmented, right? This is at a time, this is what Europe looks like, roughly around 1300. This is at a time when the caliphate in the Middle East is sort of a more or less unified kingdom. It's at a time when China is being ruled by an emperor as a unitary political unit. So at a time when other areas were seeing sort of huge authorities or huge territory, Europe is sort of this variable, sort of blend of kingdoms and principalities and city-states, duchies, with borders that are constantly shifting. Secondly, this is the one place where we see a separation of church and state as two distinct authorities with two distinct authorities. So every place else, in the caliphate, the authorities are fused. In China, we don't really see sort of the same kind of organized religion at all. And in Byzantium, these were also working much more closely together. but it's in Western Europe and Eastern Europe to some extent, where you really see the separation of these two entities and the recognition that they really function in two distinct domains. And finally, there are institutions that make European state formation strange. Among them, and probably sort of most notably, are parliaments. The idea that a king would call representatives of the people, to call nobles for a council, where assent would be given to lordly policies, is again something that's not seen anyplace else, at least not at this level. And so, even though Europe is this weird place in which to study state formation, the canonical accounts very much focus on it. And these canonical accounts locate the period, the main period of state formation, in the early modern era, from about 1500 to 1750. And they view warfare and secular conflict as the main engine of state formation. It's exemplified by Bellona, right, the painting by Rembrandt that commemorates 80 years' war between the Netherlands with Spain. And in this account, because warfare and secular conflict are the main engines, one sort of formulation has it as wars make the state and state makes wars. That's Tilley's famous sort of summation of what's going on. And this process basically has two two consequences. One is, as these states are continually at war and as they're continuously in conflict, smaller, weaker states are winnowed out. What you have basically is the consolidation of a few larger states as a result of these processes of constant conflict. Tilley famously mentions going from 500 to 30 states over this time period. Secondly, because war is costly in the early modern period, you have standing armies, you have mercenaries, you have very expensive new cannons and armaments, what you see basically is that rulers need some more resources in order to fund these wars. And therefore, you see the institutions of both taxation and parliaments arise as functional responses to this need for more resources. So taxation, to extract the resources necessary to wage war, and parliaments as someplace where assent is being given to these policies. Now, against this account, I challenge it in basically several ways. Building on this research, but also challenging it, I argue that what we really need to do is to look back to an earlier period of state formation, basically the Middle Ages, from 1000 to 1350 or so. And that's because a lot of the institutions that the focus on early modern era identifies as responses to early modern warfare, in fact, exists a very long time earlier, right? So taxes and parliaments already exist by the 12th century in many places in Europe. So early modern warfare couldn't have caused them to exist in the first place. So it basically goes back to when these institutions first began. And here it turns out that rather than secular conflict, the main mechanisms of state formation consist on the one hand of emulation of very efficient or relatively efficient church templates, and on the other hand, a constant conflict with the church among some of these rulers. As a result, the fragmentation that was supposed to have ended by the early modern period and early modern warfare is in fact persistent and constant. As you'll see, you'll basically have fragmentation that lasts well until the 19th century. And it's church influence, it's sort of church templates that lead to the emergence of institutions. In this account, institutions are the result of sort of adaptation and emulation, not a functional response to the needs of costly warfare. In short, to paraphrase Monty Python, no one expects medieval church intervention, but that's where I go. So that, of course, brings up the immediate question, the obvious question. Well, why the medieval church? Right? Why not focus on some other set of political actors? And the reason why I focus on the church is because in the Middle Ages, up until basically 1350 or so, it was the single most powerful political actor in Europe. It had enormous wealth. In some areas, as much as 40% of the land was owned by the church. It had enormous human capital at a time when something like 3% of society was literate. Nearly all of those literate clerks and experts were found in the church. And in our sort of secular age, though it's easy to forget, the church had enormous spiritual authority, right? Everyone's daily life in Europe was suffused with reminders that they lived in a highly sort of religious, highly spiritual society. More than that, the church also had enormous organizational reach that was unparalleled by any secular ruler. So for example, this is a map of the cathedrals of Europe. This is all around 1300. And on the one hand, these are these beautiful, enormous, expensive monuments to communal pride and piety, but they're also administrative centers. This is where records and archives get stored. If you want to know who owned a piece of property or who had claims on a piece of property, you'd go to the cathedral where the records were being stored. You can think of medieval cathedrals as sort of the DMVs, of their time, right? You had to wait. It was not pleasant, but you got the records that you needed. We also have monasteries that are spread across Europe, and especially in this kind of belt that stretches from Italy through England and Ireland. And these are centers of learning, where basically, manuscripts are copied and illuminated, where there's commentary provided on legal innovations, where there's constant sort of intellectual churn. They too serve as centers, where records are kept as archives. And so this is basically an enormous storehouse of human capital. And in some cases, the monks themselves came up with administrative innovations. There were reforms, for example, such as the Cluny reforms, that also diffused across Europe and also sort of provided rulers with a sense of how things could be done differently. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, there were the bishops. And bishops, these are a map again of the bishoprics. And these are not simply religious authorities or emissaries of the Pope as they are today. At the time, bishops also served incredibly important roles as basically local governors, as judges, as sort of regional authorities, and basically royal administrators. They served as ambassadors. They're all over the place. They're basically indispensable as far as both the papacy and sort of kings and rulers were concerned. So the church basically gained much of this power. This did not happen. I guess I offended.
It's a Jesuit university.
Well, the Jesuits don't come online until the 16th century, so I thought it would be okay. But, okay, you mentioned Cluny, and so the church gains much of this power in the 11th century, right? This was not exactly, it's not the case that the church was always this powerful. It had to sort of wrest a lot of its power. And in the 11th century, you have Pope Gregory VII, looking grim and poorly shaved, who launches basically this incredibly ambitious reform program. And the reform program really has two main goals. On the one hand, he really wants to centralize power within the church. He wants to assert papal power over the church. He wants to make sure that there's a clear hierarchy, that doctrine is uniform, that priests are doing what they're supposed to be doing. And on the other hand, he wants to gain autonomy from secular rulers. Because at the time, the church was not that powerful, especially in the 10th century. And as a result, secular rulers basically held it under their thumb. This is an image of Pope Leo III crowning Charlemagne, and it's really basically under Charlemagne that this really takes off. That until the 11th century, emperors and lords named their own clergy. They named the popes. They owned churches outright, so they would name a local priest and then take all the taxes from the church for themselves. They would profit from tithing and so on. And so the church was not the independent religious organization that it is today, or that eventually becomes. It was very much under the thumb of these secular rulers who exploited it for profit, who awarded the offices to their buddies, and so on. The main antagonist here for the papacy was the Holy Roman Empire. This was the main kind of source of a challenge to the papacy, and the main entity that wanted to control the papacy itself. And so you see, one of the emperors, basically Henry IV or III, named something like 5 popes, one after the other, just by himself, with no consultation of the cardinals or anything like that. He just named them outright. And the Holy Roman Empire wasn't just controlling the church. It also had extensive political and territorial ambitions. And why was the Holy Roman Empire so threatening? It's because if you look at this map, this is the Holy Roman Empire around 1200. That big blob in yellow are basically all lands that supposedly belong to the Holy Roman Empire. To be clear, as Voltaire put it, the Holy Roman Empire was none of those things, neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. It was very much a decentralized kingdom, but those are nonetheless the territories that it occupies. The area in here is the Kingdom of Sicily, which is governed at the time by allies of the Holy Roman Empire. And the area in purple that's surrounded by this pincer movement, those are the papal states, right? And so the popes are terrified that if the Holy Roman Empire gains any more power, their sort of authority over the papal states will be eliminated. So this is in effect sort of, Gregory VII's nightmare and the Holy Roman Empire's dream. This definitely was not a reference to any other monastic orders. So, right. So, if that's the case, if we have this kind of, this looming presence of the Holy Roman Empire, this kind of church as having all these advantages over secular rulers in their human and material capital, how did the church matter for state formation? Well, in the book, I basically argue that there are three distinct ways in which the church influenced this early state formation. The first of this consists of creating a distinction between church and state, which, as we saw earlier, is one of the unique things about Europe, in persistently fragmenting territorial authority. So against Tilly and others, the early modern period does not necessarily reduce fragmentation everywhere. And finally, acting as a source of institutional templates in administration, law, and parliaments. So first, the separation of church and state. Now, this is a really early and critical aspect of church influence. A very important episode in this process of distinguishing between the two authorities was the so-called investiture conflict, which coincides with Gregory VII at the beginning of his reign in 1075 and lasts basically for 50 years. And nominally, the conflict was over who names the bishops, right? Because the bishops are so important as royal administrators and emissaries of the Pope, there's constant conflict over who gets to name these really important people, and therefore who gets to claim their loyalty. That both the popes and the emperors wanted to control. Eventually, as these things often are, it's settled through negotiation and compromise. But the important part here is that this really gives rise to this distinction between church and state. And I want to be clear, again, this was not a smooth process, right? You had something like 50 years of constant conflict between, especially the Holy Roman Empire and the papacy in an attempt to hammer this out. The church unleashed its human capital and spiritual authority. It used legal arguments, alliances, and notably excommunications, which has led to this, fantastic lithograph, and also the classic apocryphal, but nonetheless really great story that kind of captures what the conflict was about. So Emperor Henry IV basically kept naming his own bishops, and Gregory VII excommunicates them, says you're now outside the community of the church. You're no longer part. You can no longer take sacraments, and any nobles that are loyal to you are released from their obligations. So his allies began to desert him, and Henry IV basically decides to jujitsu the Pope. He travels in January across the Alps through the snow to the castle where the Pope is staying, knowing full well that if you are a sincere penitent, you have to be granted absolution. You can imagine what the family conversations were like, because he is accompanied by his wife and young child as they schlepped across the snowy Alps. And once he gets there, Henry IV basically stands in front of the doors of the fort where the Pope was staying, bareheaded and barefooted, and stands like that for 3 days and 3 nights in the snow. This is where you begin to realize that the story must be a little bit apocryphal. And of course, the Pope then basically releases him from the excommunication. He's welcomed back to the community. He instantly travels back across the Alps and proceeds to name his own bishops all over again. In fact, Henry IV becomes a record holder of sorts. He is excommunicated 5 different times by 3 different popes. So clearly, this was not a smooth process. It's also a process that basically allows for some editorializing, because this is from John Fox, 1563, the English Reformation. And John Fox describes Gregory VII as the Antichrist, because he asserted too much secular authority over a secular ruler. You can imagine how well this went over in Henrician England. So that's the story of the separation of church and state. Again, not a smooth process, but one where in this constant conflict, you see increasing recognition that the popes and religion travel in one sphere, and the domain of secular rule is another one for the kings and for the emperors. Now, the second thing that happens is that the church fragments Europe. This map that I showed you earlier is directly the result of church action, because in this constant struggle between this powerful church and the Holy Roman Empire, basically also has the second consequence of fragmenting territorial authority. So in existing accounts, the fragmentation of Europe is just something that happens. The Carolingian Empire falls apart, and here we are, faced with a multiplicity of tiny states. But I argue that it's actually deliberate. It doesn't happen when the Carolingian Empire collapses in the late 9th century. It really takes off in the 12th century and the 11th century when the popes really start to make a deliberate effort to fragment Europe. And they do so because they want to ensure their own autonomy. Again, they're very concerned with Holy Roman Empire influence on the papacy. And as a result, the chief target is the Holy Roman Empire. Now, in this kind of warfare, there's sort of multiple instruments that the popes relied on. They relied on wars by proxy. They rarely led battles themselves, and when they did, it tended to end very badly, so they quickly realized that it's better to pay others to do so. They entered in all kinds of alliances and coalitions with secular rulers. They deposed some rulers, basically encouraging sort of the nobles surrounding the king to depose the king. And they launched numerous political crusades. Now, we tend to think of crusades, as these sort of huge expeditions to the Middle East to reclaim Jerusalem and so on. But in fact, that's a very small proportion of what the crusades look like. Of this 150 or so crusades that took place from the Middle Ages onwards, only 30 fit this description of travel to the Far East. Instead, 80 are explicitly political, with 28 basically being designed to go after a specific ruler, and something like 22 being designed to basically reclaim territory. So the vast majority of crusades are political exercises. They're there to go after rulers, to go after territory, to assert papal authority. This is very different from the image that we have of crusades. Now, to test the impact, this is the sort of technical part of the talk. I gathered a whole bunch of data on papal conflict, on excommunications, monasteries, bishoprics, and universities. It basically spans 1,000 years of European history. So, of course, we have to have a huge caveat here. The further back you go in history, the more the data is not only missing, but not missing at random, right? Archives get burnt on the order of conquerors. Entire swathes of data basically are eliminated from the pool that's available to us. And the further we go back in time, of course, the less reliable these records are. We can't really expect medieval monks to keep statistics the same way that their modern counterparts could. So I basically gathered this data using data with existing data on secular conflict, communism parliaments, and so on. And the main sort of finding that comes out, and this is sort of verified in various ways, is that papal conflict with the papacy, is strongly and positively associated with fragmentation of Europe. And what's peculiar here, this is the line in blue here, this is papal conflict. It does so in the Middle Ages, but not in the early modern period, right? So when the church is powerful, it can really fragment Europe. But subsequently, there's less conflict with the papacy. The papacy loses a lot of its power, and it's unable to sort of fragment Europe in the same way by 1500 or so. And I mentioned earlier that the fragmentation persists. And it does so largely because the Holy Roman Empire remains totally fragmented. So this is just a graph of how many different states exist within the territory of given countries. And you can see that places like England were incredibly consolidated early on. Italy becomes increasingly consolidated, but it's the Holy Roman Empire that at one point contains anywhere, we actually don't know how many statelets there were. So anywhere from 250 to 400 states. These are the ones that were just documented. And there are two things to note here. One is that this fragmentation really takes off in 1100. It's not something that happened earlier after the collapse of the Carolingian Empire. It only really starts to take off then. And secondly, is that it doesn't end with the early modern wars. It ends, there's kind of a blip here with the Napoleonic Wars, but the main way in which what is now Germany becomes a unified country is through explicitly political efforts in the mid-19th century by Bismarck and others. So this fragmentation, these early modern wars simply don't have the winnowing out effect, at least not in the Holy Roman Empire. And as a result, what we see, if this is Europe in 1300, 400 years later, what you have basically is, the Ottoman Empire and Poland and Lithuania expanding. But the kind of core of Europe, of the Holy Roman Empire, remains as fragmented as ever. If we focus just on the Holy Roman Empire, this is what it looks like in 1300. That's the area in gray. And this is what it looks like in 1600. Even more fragmented, despite the fact that by this point it should have been consolidating if the bellicists were right. And this fragmentation is so durable, partly because it creates its own vested interests. So the church, of course, loses power, right? By the 15th century, it's nowhere near as powerful as it was in the Middle Ages. But it nonetheless, this fragmentation nonetheless persists, partly because nobles, bishops, and princes had gained power earlier, right? The emperor, as he engages in this endless conflict with the papacy, basically gives away chunks of land and all the authority that comes with it to these local bishops, princes, dukes, and so on. And that means basically that they are now sort of powerful entities in their own territories. They are the ones who provide order, they're the ones who tax, and so on. And they're not going to give this up. Secondly, you also have self-governing or autonomous cities, also basically being granted all kinds of rights as the emperor tries to get their support for this kind of conflict. And so these nobles and these cities basically become entrenched. And even though the church can no longer fragment Europe, they ensure that the emperor would ever be able to sort of exercise centralized control over these lands. Now, if the church sort of, separated itself from the state, if it fragmented Europe, it also acted as a template. And in many ways, the Catholic Church was an institutional pioneer. Bishops were the critical conduits through which all these sort of innovations traveled from the Vatican to various capitals. And they did so in three different areas: in administration, in law and learning, and in parliaments. So if the church could fragment territorial authority, it could also serve as a model for how it should function. So first, when it comes to administration, the familiar division of labor in most royal courts was of a chancery that took care of all the letters, a camera in charge of finances, and a judiciary that basically sort of, administered law and order. And all of these, that division of labor, comes directly from the papal court, right? So this basically becomes, it's not that these distinctions are perfect, but nonetheless, these distinctions are the ones that the church develops, and then they get adopted by secular rulers. Bishops continue to serve this role as judges, lords, and administrators. And so they make sure that whatever happens in the Vatican, because they have to travel back and forth, eventually finds its way to these royal courts. And this consists of, some of the innovations consist of a petition system, where you can sort of seek redress with the ruler, of direct taxation, which is really the result of the Crusades, and of an entire appeals system, right? That if you don't find justice at one level, you can go further up. All of these are sort of, ecclesiastical innovations that travel to temporal courts. This goes even as far as the formulas, documents, and handwriting that was being used in these courts. So this is, and please don't try to read it. This is, Magna Carta, right, in 1215, one of the most famous documents in Western history. And just look at the style of the handwriting. Because this is the papal bull that annuls it 10 weeks later, in identical and same handwriting. And the reason for that is because the church adopts something called the Carolingian minuscule, perfects it, and then, because Latin is the lingua franca, and because bishops wield this constantly, this becomes adopted by nearly every royal court, right? This is like the standardized handwriting. This is also the reason why it's so much nicer to read medieval documents than anything, for example, from the 19th century or the 18th century, as I'm sure several people in this room know. But what's critical here is that, both secular and papal authorities adopt the same handwriting, and it spreads from the Vatican outwards. As a result of this kind of, church influence, the pattern that emerges is really that of the church as being sort of, the first place where a lot of these institutions are founded. Now, this is a graph that summarizes various institutions. These are taxes, courts, parliaments, chanceries, administrative offices, and so on. And there's two things to note here. One is that the church is the institutional pioneer. That's the band in red. So it comes up with many of these innovations or readaptations earlier than anybody else. And secondly, the Holy Roman Empire is the last one to try and adopt centralizing reforms. And what's critical here is that it does so basically at the end of the 15th century. And when it tries to centralize, these attempts fail. Within 20 years, a lot of the sort of centralizing reforms totally collapse. And the emperors, until the end of the Holy Roman Empire, are unable to centralize power. And so this sort of pattern, and this graph summarizes this a little bit. Now, we also have law. And similarly here, the rule of law in Europe was also shaped by the church. This is an image of Gregory IX handing down law, right? And this is, a petitioner using this law in a secular court that's presided over by a bishop. It sort of nicely encapsulates this entire process. Now, when it comes to law, civil law, basically, that's being taught across Europe, you can still see sort of, multiple influences of this today, consists both of Roman law, which gets rediscovered in the 11th century, when a monastery produces one of the few surviving codices from the 5th and 6th century. And so this is sort of this Roman law that gets systematized, rediscovered, and presented. And subsequently, the kind of systemization of canon law, which occurs in the early 12th century. And that too shows heavy influence of Roman law. And the two of these basically are sort of amalgamated, right? They're taught as one body of law everywhere in Europe for most of this time period. Law really starts to get used in the investiture conflict. It's not coincidence that this Roman codex gets rediscovered around 1175 or so, just as the investiture conflict takes off. And here, again, bishops act as judges, right? They're the ones who sort of really enforce or use and rely on this law. The participation of bishops also changes procedure. So, for example, because clerics cannot get their hands bloodied, right? Trial by ordeal ends across Europe. And it largely ends because bishops are participating in this, and they cannot sort of, find evidence through, or they cannot decide for the trials through torture. Several concepts that become critical, not just to medieval societies, but to our societies, all stem from basically church interpretations, canonical interpretations of either Roman law or canon law. And so the idea of a corporation, right, a universitas, what we are part of right now, is very much from the church, who views itself as a corporation. So a fictive actor that is composed of multiple individuals, none of whom bear direct responsibility for what the corporation does. The idea of a plena potestas, right? The full power that representatives wield when they cast votes on our behalf, comes from the church and church councils. The idea of impersonal office is also enshrined in canon and Roman law, right? The idea that the person might die, but the office does not. The sanctity of contracts, and even the primacy of the rule of law over any individual, all come directly from canonical interpretations of the sort of legal revolution. But and those are the direct effects. There's also an indirect effect, because this demand for law, this kind of burgeoning of huge burgeoning of law and legal concepts, leads to the rise of universities. So the first university is founded in Bologna in 1088 at the height of the investiture controversy. And immediately, this kind of importance of this human capital is recognized by both popes and secular rulers. Popes grant students the status of clergy, which is incredibly valuable because it means that they're protected from sort of the incursions of the city of angry city folk. Town and gown relations were not great in the Middle Ages. It also means that if students are accused of anything, they're tried in the ecclesiastical court, right, as clergy. And there's no, for example, capital punishment in canonical courts. So that's the place you want to be where, if you're arrested in any way as a student. Papal bulls, basically, papal charters, give universities enormous autonomy, right? So it's not just the students are protected. The universities are seen as corporations that are separate and autonomous from the areas where they live. They also give them effective accreditation. If you go to a university that's been chartered by the Pope, that means that you can, if you have a degree from that university, you can teach anywhere across the Europe. So this is kind of, the American Association of University Professors, but in the Middle Ages. And because some things don't change, at some point we have either taught this guy or been this guy, and I'm sure you'll recognize. And of course, secular rulers also recognize how important this might be, right? And so what winds up happening is kind of an arms race between emperors and the Holy Roman emperors and popes to charter universities. And here, the papal charters are in purple, the green ones are secular, And this is not the foundation of universities. Most universities are founded spontaneously, but rather they're chartered, a kind of legal accreditation, recognition, and protection. And you can see that in the Middle Ages, the popes really have a lead up until, of course, the Protestant Reformation, when papal charters of universities drop off precipitously, and charters of secular rulers go up instead. And of course, there's a blip in the 19th and 20th century, and that has a lot to do with Latin America, and universities being founded in Latin America, often under very difficult circumstances, but under the protection of the Pope. And finally, as if all of this weren't enough, there are parliaments and representation. And this is probably the place that's, in some ways you can see the fingerprints of the church most heavily. Because the church had earlier come up with the idea of course, tithes and taxation of clergy itself. And very quickly, what develops is a rule that which touches all has to be decided by all, right? So if you're going to tax the clergy tell the Pope, you have to have our consent. And that rule underpins basically nearly all policymaking in modern democracies. Now, you can't, of course, have all the clergy come to the Vatican and come to Rome and decide these things or assent to papal suggestions. So instead, the church also comes up, and this starts as early as the 9th century, with the idea of binding of proctorial representation. So you can be a canon chapter, and the clergy can elect a leader and or a representative, and that representative has full powers to basically assent to whatever the Pope asks him to, and then have a decision bind his community to that decision. And this again is the underpinning of modern democracy, right? We can't all go to Washington, though some have tried. We can't all go to Washington, and we certainly want our representatives to have some kind of power, right? Otherwise, what's the point of representation? And both of these sort of principles, these sort of concepts that are fundamental to representative democracy, arise directly from the church, and they're transported once again via the bishops, because the bishops sit in all these parliaments, right, ex officio. A third of the English parliament is composed of clergy, and so they basically insist on these rights being held up by secular rulers as well. There are also sort of smaller things like the idea of supermajority rules or majority rules also comes from the church. In the Middle Ages, nearly all decisions were supposed to be made by consensus. And it's the church that decides, there's a more efficient way of doing this. And so instead, let's have the bigger and better part of a given group make the decisions. And so we get majority rules. This really doesn't like conciliarism. Okay. And finally, there's even conciliarism, right? So a stream or current of political thought within the church. And so the late 14th, 15th century, that basically asserts the primacy of the assembly, of these assemblies, over the rulers. And of course, this gets put down very quickly, gets tamped down very quickly within the church. It actually kind of there's certainly absolutist, the rulers want nothing to do with it, but it becomes sort of an organizing principle, sort of an assertion of the power of the assembly. It even pops up, of all places, in the French Revolution, when some of the revolutionaries rely on this as a principle of asserting their supremacy over the king. So against sort of existing accounts, these canonical accounts I talked about earlier, all these institutions arose before the costly wars of the 16th and 17th century. Whether it's taxation or parliament or law, all of them come online much, much earlier than they would have if they had been really prompted by the early modern conflict. They're not incidental. These aren't functional responses. These are adaptations and reinterpretations of church templates and innovations. And it's important to note here that it's in any story of institutional creation, it's not enough to have incentives to create an institution. You also have to have resources with which to do so. And the church provides these resources. And finally, there's a sort of a whole stream of literature and economics that basically argues that religion, and especially Catholicism, are bad for economic growth, bad for trade, bad for all these things. These early innovations actually promoted human capital, they promoted trade, and they promoted economic growth, at least during this time period. So the church was the medieval church especially, was very active in separating church and state and fragmenting political authority, and in these patterns of institutional adoption and adaptation. And that, I think, largely helps to explain what we saw earlier, this kind of unique European path, a path that's marked by the rule of law, by the rise of universities, and by sort of unprecedented and unique national assemblies. And of course, here there's a feedback loop. Because as states interact with the church and as they emulate it, they grow in strength, right? They become more powerful themselves vis-a-vis the church. They start to use law as a weapon. They have their own university graduates. They assert sovereignty against the papacy, and so on. And so what basically happens is this process where there's a transfer of resources from the papacy to these secular rulers, and these states start to grow up. And in a pattern familiar to anyone who is teenagers, they grow up and start to resent the church, right? They start to want to break free from church influence and from this kind of church templates. So in conclusion, what I argue here is that medieval state formation is very different from early modern. War alone does not make the states, but emulation is sufficient in many cases. And above all, these sacred and deep foundations are religious, even if they give rise to profoundly secular institutions. And that helps to explain what many see as sort of European uniqueness. Thank you.
So, I want to talk about
I can just talk for a few minutes.
Okay, yeah, perfect.
Because I'm so taking
That's great.
It is indeed. It's an interesting book. It's well, no, it's very interesting, and it's offering a alternative explanation for the rise of the state, and it's really well written. And those you don't just get those things normally in academia. In fact, it's often you get annoyed with a well-written book because you're taking so much time to read it and enjoy it. And this book is very well written, as well as the details, as well as the analysis that you'll pull out of it as well, which I believe will have probably will have a fundamental shaping of how you look at this historical process, this big, longue durée historical institutional process. So that's my plug for the book. And then, so I wanted to say a couple of things that my specialty in political science is in the state literature, the comparative state literature, and so I'm well versed in the debates, and in these case studies. Europe, it's a very Eurocentric field, and so I just wanted to say the things about the book that are a major contribution to that literature, and then I'll say some things that I want to push back at. All right, but Anna has staked out the claim as the person who brought the church back in, whereas Tilly and Scotchpole brought the state back in. Anna has brought the church back into comparative politics. And the other book, it's not as a historical institutional state building book, but it's the role of the church in politics and policy making. And the role of religion in politics, I think, for a long time got short shrift in comparative politics. And she's at the forefront of changing that. In terms of bringing the church back into the story of state building, there were people who made arguments about religion and state building, Głuski in particular, and they tended to be more ideological arguments. And what this book does is it doesn't really address that question, so I don't know where you necessarily stand on the Głuski and the disciplinary revolution, conceptual revolution. But what it does do is it goes at the at the core of what is state building and the building of infrastructural capacity, and then is able to, in a very, very persuasive way, in a very effective way, to show off the major contribution that the church had in building the in developing the foundation for the infrastructural capacity of what will become the modern state. All right, so, and that's a big accomplishment. The emphasis on things like extraction, which are covered well in the book, on territorial administrative capacity, that's covered well in the book. We saw all the bishoprics up there. And what, so those are the things you normally think of, like territorial administration, extraction. I'm talking about the state. But also, the book does so well to put the spotlight on the people who did that. Putting the emphasis on the human capital, the people who had the ability to balance a ledger, the people who had the ability to write those laws, etc., and how they came from the church. I mean, Richelieu and Mazarin, the people that come to mind when you think of state building, and they're products of the Catholic Church. So we know that. And the book also was a revelation for me, was the role of the church in explaining why Italy and why the Middle Europe, why Germany, why the area of the Holy Roman Empire was for so long so fragmented, even after the early modern state building push is on. And so those are among the takeaways from the book that will really be incorporated into how I think of the process anyway. So here are so I picked 4 things, okay? And you've heard them all before, I have no doubt. And they're not criticisms of what the book's doing, and they're kind of part questions as how do you fit this in, and they're part at least a little bit pushback on some things. But the first is when I think of the role of, up till this book, when I think of the role of the church and the process of the rise of the European state, I think of the moral authority of the church and the role that the church had in being able to pick winners and losers in what were the tribal conflicts in Northern Europe, in the Baltic region, in Scandinavia, and further east, in the Orthodox Church does that in some places further east. But the it's not part of this story, but I feel like it's a really important part of the story in that the church's moral authority in building an alliance with particular local political actors was crucial to the process of the transition. It's from political anthropology, the transition from tribal politics to chiefdoms, to kind of more established fixed territories, to more permanent forms of political power, the beginning of the inherited political power in chiefdoms, and the church being able to pick out Mieszko and doing that for Poland is the beginning of the Polish state. So it's not part of this story. The infrastructure part of it isn't. But that I was just wondering if you would agree with that and think it's already been done, or it's just something different, or maybe you didn't agree with it. A second area was so we know what the modern state is. We live in a state, or the postmodern state, I suppose we live in. But we know what the modern state is, and we have a pretty good idea of what early modern states what they looked like as well. And now you're taking us back. We're taking a step back, and we're looking at the evolution of institutions that become incorporated with the state, and putting a spotlight on the role of the church in creating, what I've already mentioned, these infrastructural foundations. And I couldn't help but thinking, but if we're going to start with this, is this a game that's going to end? Can we not step back even further? Can we? Is what the church doing an innovation, something new, something created, or is the church adapting something else that was out there, and particularly the institutional residue of what was the Roman Empire? And in the Roman Empire, is the bishop not something similar to what a proconsul was? The Roman Empire also did the rationalization of functions of juridical, of military, of fiscal. The Roman Empire did territorial administration. I mean, like Seeing Like a State, the famous Scott book. You could also be seeing like a bishop in this book, but then you could also be seeing like a proconsul. I mean, they were centered in urban areas, and then they mocked out like a rectangular territorial administrative districts, and mocked them off like the grid in New York City, with stones and that's state building. I mean, that's a fundamental part of the state building as well. The infrastructural projects, the roads and the bridges and aqueducts and the wine. So I was just wondering if you think that what the church is doing did it create something new, or did it adapt something that had been worked out to some extent previously? So like the ways you do taxation and stuff are different in Rome. All right. The third area was well, this is a question I had, and I think it might be so. Anna and I know each other because we study the post-communist world of Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. But in that world, I was a Russia guy. And I think Anna has, she knows Russia, of course, but she also is kind of a Polish woman. Well, she knows the Western fringe better than I do. And I was just, when I was looking at this book and what it was saying, all right, and you just can't help but thinking about things and how, whether it's explaining it or whether it seems to compete against it, in some way. So go to this period in this conflict where you had the lithograph. It's Gregory the Seventh and it's Henry the Fourth. And I think, what if Henry IV? So this is a long period we're talking about, the rise of the modern state. It's kind of arbitrary about it, but you could start it in 800, maybe with Charlemagne and this first attempt at a united Europe. I mean, it can go back earlier to Clovis, even maybe. But if you start like in the 800, in the 9th century. Charlemagne, and then you're taking it into the 17th century. You're doing that's like 900 years. We're pushing 1,000 years from 750 to like 1650. That's 900 years, and this period, in a span of 900 years, seems relatively. It's small. It's just a piece. And is this just a conjuncture in which, for a short time, religious authority was able to trump secular authority, and why was that? And if Henry IV had been Peter the Great, I mean, it's a just, a conjunctural thing, but could this period have worked out a little bit different, and might some of these same things have taken we might see them in some form or other anyway. If the Normans hadn't been coming through town, which gave like an alternative force to ally with, might this period have looked a bit different? Because in the long durée, it's a mostly secular period. All right, okay. And then the last thing is that I'm really a Tilly guy, and so it was one of the reasons I wanted to read the book and wanted to see if I would rethink what I think about the Tilly argument and the military revolution argument. And I thought that I could have this book and this contribution and adjust how I think and put the church in there. But it doesn't make me have to reject, or even less so, to throw out Tilly or to play down the role of the military revolution in the emergence of the early modern state. I think that if you this period and beginning a few years earlier this is the transition out of medieval, but the transition out of feudalism and the organization of political power in society. The political economy of feudalism is very particular, and I've always been influenced by the old book by Lynn White, the technology and social change, and it was it's a bit simple and it's a short book, but it essentially argues that the introduction of the stirrup and transformed the organization of political power and socio-economic relations in Europe because of the military implications of that. The rise of war being fought by mounted shock cavalry led to that fragmentation of power and economic resources that sustained military conflict in the feudal period. And I was always persuaded by that connection. So that the feudal economy is serving the needs of warfare. And political power is more personalistic. Warfare can be private affairs. You need you need these elite warriors that can, and the horses or whatever. And so the fixing of peasants to the lands, all served that well until the military revolution. And the military revolution just introduces a whole new technology of weapons. So you know this. You'll know your way around this and thrash it, no doubt. But just introduces a whole new way of fighting. No more less so cavalry and more so infantry. No more swords and spears, and now it's firearms. No more longbows, now you have bombards and you have cannons. No more galley ships, now you have war galleons with like 40, 60 cannons mounted on the side that are transoceanic. So there's this fundamental transformation in the way war is fought. And the Tilly argument and the military revolution argument is that as you emerge out of the feudal period, it wasn't necessarily inevitable that the way in which political power is organized in the territorial-based, centralized sovereign state was going to prevail, that it did have these rivals like Holy Roman empire, like the city-states and the city leagues. And that through warfare, one particular form of organizing political power and of extracting revenue and resources to be able to engage, create these economies of scale that were able to be invested into the weapon systems and the larger armies and the sustained conflicts of the later period that you make reference to. Your focus is on an earlier period. But I feel like what you're contributing doesn't necessarily negate that the military revolution had a profound effect on which way to organize power ultimately won, on the ultimate victory of the territorial-based state. So that was the fourth thing that I wanted to say, and get in my Tilly thing that I know you've heard only 100 times at least, and can do well with. Okay. And it's a fabulous book.
So please feel free to respond to part, or
well,
you can also think of questions that you'd like to ask.
I speak very quickly, so I think the first when it comes to picking winners and losers. So the papacy very much tries to do that. It's just that most of the time it doesn't succeed, right? So the papacy's big ploy was, let's have elected rulers, because if you have elected rulers, then it's empowers the nobles, and also it empowers us, the papacy, to influence the outcome. And basically, no one bought it, right? So Poland, Hungary, and eventually the Holy Roman Empire were the three places where you have elected rulers. The rest of the time, the papacy basically failed, right? And so sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Secondly, when it comes to the legacy of Rome, so the church is very good, it's very opportunistic at picking up institutional innovations. And of course, Walter Scheldel has written a beautiful book called The Escape from Rome, and the ways in which that was the last kind of functional, unified empire in European history. And that ends very quickly. But what so there's some traces that are still left. For example, the whole idea of a diocese, right, is directly taken from Roman administrative units. But the big source for the church was really the Carolingian Empire, because that happened. That only fell apart, 150 years before these big changes. And what it does is basically pick up things from the Holy Roman Empire and then perfect them. So the Holy Roman Empire had a system of missi, right? So, roaming representatives who would sort of check out that everything was going well. The papacy basically codifies these and remakes and gives the bishops many of the same roles. And the advantage, of course, is that the bishops are right there on the ground, and they have to report to the Vatican, but they remain on the ground, so you have a constant presence. So it's a classic sort of church. So it's not that the church invents this out of nothing. It's just that a lot of these sources are a bit more recent than that. And then I think it's an important thing to note that if you want to look at some places where Roman, many more sort of Roman offices and whatnot are preserved, that's the Orthodox world, right? That's Russia and other Orthodox churches, where after 1054 in the Great Schism, what you have is a church that asserts its autonomy in the West, and a church that runs into the arms of the temporal rulers in the East to get protection, to make sure that that they survive as an entity. And rulers there, whether in Byzantium or in Muscovy, exert enormous influence over the church. They name bishops, they participate in church councils, they write doctrine, for heaven's sake. And the church there basically has neither the incentive nor the capacity to innovate. So what it does instead is to preserve many of the Roman offices down to their names at the sort of Orthodox courts. And this also helps to explain, by the way, to this day, the Western Church cares so much about issues of social justice or of nuclear arms, of abortion and so on, of major social issues that it can criticize autonomously. Whereas the Orthodox Church fundamentally cares about two things: its tax status and limiting competition. Right? That's what it's a much more sort of institution-bound sort of interest. And finally, I am not, I take Tilly to church, but I don't, remove Tilly from the conversation. Of course, war was important. And of course, the early modern period sees this massive revolution in how war is waged. I'm not in any way denying that. I just don't think that's where we should look to see where the sort of roots of institutions such as taxation or parliaments. And I don't think that that's the only thing that matters in this sort of huge swathe of European history and European state formation. Something like that. No, you didn't get to answer. You get to answer.
We'll let him speak again at the end.
At the end, exactly. He's the last one.
But would anybody like, yes, I see a question in the back from Jacob.
Hi, thank you so much for your great talk. I'm curious what your thoughts are. So I think you argue pretty persuasively that the church had a big role in the establishment of the modern state, and I'm wondering what you think the modern day implications are for that. If there are these maybe remnants and influences coming from the church, do you think there's information or novel insights that we could take to address modern political issues with these states that originated from the church?
So I want to be very careful. I don't make the claim that the medieval church shapes how we govern today. I don't think that's the case at all. I think these are some of these foundations that some of which sort of attenuate and dissipate entirely. No one cares about supermajority rules except in a very few contexts. Some of which survive to this day, like the rule of law. So I'm not making the claim that somehow there's a direct correspondence between the two. What I would say is something much broader, which is that I think as social scientists and as policy analysts, we tend to lose sight of religion. And we tend to lose sight of how much it matters to so many people, right? That it can be an independent motivator for action. It can be a totally independent justification for action. That people will do unspeakable things in order to protect both their children and their religion. Those are the two things that people are willing to die for more than anything else. And so I think it would behoove us to take religion much more seriously as a social force, as an animating force than a lot of our sort of secular analyses would have us to say.
Not Sir Benedict.
Well, thank you so much for your informative talk. Apart from just being so interesting in itself, I just think it's important, I'm speaking as a non-Christian, that it's important for Western humanity to be aware of its debt to the Christianity and the church. But having said that, I thought your talk ignored a very important dimension of the whole issue, and that is the role of secular philosophic thought. And so one could have political organization, but it matters how you conceive of that organization. For instance, the notion of the state has no corresponding thought in the entire Greek thought, and of course in modernity that becomes the way we think of politics. So my question is that I'm aware that Machiavelli speaks of Stato, but in this early period, when did people start thinking of the secular rule as state?
So certainly not in this time period, right? In the Middle Ages, what's much more intelligible are notions of authority, of kingship, of this thing called lordship. Those are all intelligible. But the idea of a state or a nation state makes no sense whatsoever. That arises much later. Sorry? Yeah, and that's 1500s. That's much later. What does arise is the notion of sovereignty. And this is, again, one of those sort of papal self-goals, where the papacy in 1202, in an attempt to further fragment the Holy Roman Empire, announces that every secular ruler should think of themselves as a prince in their own kingdom. Basically reject imperial rule, reject the Holy Roman Empire. And, this of course is an attempt to weaken the Holy Roman Empire. And the princes initially take that on and say, no, absolutely, sure, we can exercise this principle in our territory. But then they realize they can also use that against the papacy, right? And they're so fine. If we're a prince in our, if that's the notion of sovereignty as freedom from outside influence and absolute rule within, that extends to other matters as well. And so you, the Pope, have no right to collect taxes or ask the bishops to sort of, perform your jobs here, or to sort of exercise any kind of influence on our politics. So the notion of sovereignty can be traced back to this kind of inadvertent church innovation. The notion of the state has almost nothing to do with the church, other than this vague idea of a corporation. But that's a very interesting
Grzymała-Busse.
Thanks so much for a very captivating, very clear talk about stuff that I know very little about. But,
That's why it's clear.
my question is pitched at a level of generalization that doesn't do justice to the detail that you went into, but it has to do with what was just raised in Nasser's question about debates about the growth of the secular. And do you see your work contributing to that ongoing debate as to whether secularism emerged from European history and is being transposed to non-Western societies, to Al-Assad's argument? And the second has to do with what is typically a Protestant argument, that Protestantism is the origins of the modern state, and the Bavarian drum that people like to beat that you gestured to in your introduction. Do you see your work revising or speaking into that narrative or offering a corrective to what is often attributed to the influence of Protestantism?
I would say two things. One, I think, is that the church already starts to separate the two spheres. It's not that it in any way thinks that secular authority is superior to it in religious matters. But this idea of two domains, of a spiritual domain where the papacy reigns supreme and a temporal one where local rulers do, that arises as a result of these broad processes of the 11th and 12th century conflict. So that's definitely where the origin of that arises. As for the Protestant Reformation, it has a really interesting effect in Catholic countries as well. So in both Protestant and in Catholic countries, the Catholic Church had already been weakened. With the Protestant Reformation, it's totally on the back foot. And it's not just in the Protestant countries where you basically have clergy become state employees, right? They become bureaucrats, fully paid state employees. It also happens in the Catholic countries. So in both France and in Spain, kings basically announced that from now on, any papal bulls that arrive into the country, and that's spiritual authority, right, have to be cleared with the king first. That any bishops who travel to Rome and back have to be cleared with the king because they don't want the subversive ones coming back and forth. The church gets taxed much more heavily, and there's much more influence on who gets to be named priests, bishops, archbishops, and so on. So in a very odd way, the Protestant Reformation reinforces already existing trends, but what it does basically in all countries is to put clergy very much, and the churches very much on this in a secondary role when it comes to governance and when it comes to the exercise of authority. It's kind of the assertion of temporal rule.
I'm really interested in how you describe the fragmentation of the Holy Roman Empire. So two things that stick out to me is that I feel like my understanding of, first of all, imperial administration, starting with Otto the Great, is that the Ottonians and the Salians lean heavily on the church in the first place. The imperial chancellor is the church. So fundamentally, the church is the state in the Middle Ages. And then, as soon as Henry IV, basically as soon as the emperors start coming into Lombardy, the churches start to feel really unsafe, especially when the Normans come up, right? And my thing is that I feel like it's not that the church is, not that the state is drawing from the church, it's that literally they get excommunicated 11 times. And they realize that the church is not a stable ally to rely on in terms of that. So they had to quickly replace those institutions. And we see that with Louis the Bavarian, when he starts, codifying how do you elect a Holy Roman Emperor, and in that document there is no reference to the church whatsoever. He is literally excommunicated for most of his reign, but he's able to maintain all the German bishoprics, basically, in terms of providing him support and power. And, that's something that's continued by the Luxembourgs. So I'm wondering how, especially when the church gets, I feel like it gets weaker after the Concordat forms-ish, maybe a little later. How does that play into your theory of the fragmentation of the Roman Empire?
So, it's very telling that Louis the Bavarian makes no reference to the church because he really doesn't want to have to deal with it any further, right? This is an assertion of, we are going to run our affairs as we see fit. I think, it speaks to a broader point that, again, as I said, this is not an easy process, but what the church repeatedly tries to do is not just, excommunications are only a small part of the story. And in fact, one of the findings in the book is that, excommunications don't actually alter how long you stay in office, right? So kings who are excommunicated and kings who aren't stay in office just as long. In fact, there's a slight advantage to being excommunicated. So it's not really, that's not really the main mechanism. But what the popes are very good at doing are building alliances. Because in the Holy Roman Empire, you have these constantly shifting sort of alliances between the various princes and the duchies. And that's what the church exploits, right? So the papacy basically buys off its allies. It's very fond of, funding French expeditions, across, into the area. It's very fond of sort of, of all kinds of balancing maneuvers. It heavily supports Poland, it heavily supports the Nordic countries, all as a balancing act against the Holy Roman Empire. So it's less than, that excommunication somehow fragment the Holy Roman Empire, than it is a repeated sort of series of attempts to build coalitions, to balance against the emperor, to continue kind of, prevent him from basically being able to in any way start to centralize his rule.
It's been mentioned a lot. I'd like to talk about the sacredness of these foundations and sort of the ideological question. Is there anything about the theology of the church that you think contributes to this process? Or is it just powerful institutions fighting over wealth and authority?
Yeah, so Emily and I were talking about that earlier. I think, so this is, it's funny because this is a book, and, Nasser's question goes to this as well.
Mm-hmm.
This is a book where the church is basically seen as an institutional and organizational actor. So theology doesn't really enter it, doctrine doesn't really enter it. In fact, there's very little, the modal pope in the 13th century was a lawyer, right? They weren't sort of, theologians, they were lawyers, and they governed like lawyers. So I think, that there may be a story there, but it's not one that I tell in this book. It's much more as, a vying for power between what are fundamentally political actors.
When you draw that distinction between this moment of differentiation between temporal and ecclesiastical power, what does that actually mean in terms of what the church believes to be its domain? I mean, this links back, I guess, to your previous book and church's influence in the public policy realm, even after that differentiation. So how do you bridge that?
So, and I think it is absolutely the case, as was pointed out, right, that these authorities are fused up until pretty much the 12th century. So it's very hard to talk. I refer to secular and ecclesiastical. It would make much more sense to think about temporal and maybe canonical, right? It means they're not, secular doesn't exist as a concept yet. But what I do think is happening is that there's this kind of initial, increasing recognition that the church stands for matters spiritual. It wields spiritual authority. It's kind of the Gelasian swords, right? This is where doctrine comes in. So the church will wield spiritual authority, and it has absolute authority in any matters of doctrine and theology. And temporal rulers can decide what they do within their territories as they see fit when it comes to administration, governance, and whatnot. The problem is that even though these are that's the conceptual nature of the compromise, there's so much overlap, right? So if you are a student and you're being tried in an ecclesiastical court, there are plenty of townspeople who are furious about this because they want to drag the guy through the mud and basically kick him out for whatever it is that he did. And instead he's getting softer justice in the ecclesiastical courts. At one point, my favorite sort of anecdata is that at one point in the English courts, something like 40% of contract disputes and marriage disputes and family law disputes that should have been settled in the secular courts, in fact, went to the canonical ones because they were much more efficient, the justice was much more effective, and people saw them as more legitimate. So conceptually, there's a clear distinction. In practice, there's constant conflict over who gets to adjudicate what. And that persists until today.
Well, but also related to that is, and we invoke Weber and Tilly, is when Weber says the church is, the state is the ultimate political authority for the people on a bounded territory with a monopoly of with a legitimate monopoly of violence. And even Tilly's very cynical protection racket has the component of legitimation. Mm-hmm. And the sacred foundations is the moral of thought, even after the point at which secular kings and dukes and princes were less constrained by the Pope. They still needed their position and the political order over which they presided to be legitimated by the moral authority of the church. It continues to this day. It's in the 19th century, of course, any political system is by definition a few people telling a lot of people what they should do. So it's a hierarchical order, and how do you get everyone to say, I will do it because I believe in this order? And so I think at that level, it's something it comes up in the book, but it's not direct in the book. But the moral authority, when the moral authority comes in, even into the early modern period, this was a hugely important thing that the church did for political, for the state, for the early state.
So my third book is all about how the churches exercise their moral authority, right, and where they can and where they can't, and different strategies. So I totally agree with the importance of moral authority. I just think that it's easy, even though this was an incredibly religious age. It is easy to overstate how important that legitimation was, because if being repeatedly excommunicated doesn't prevent you from ruling for 40 years, that suggests that the church's power is actually limited. And when realpolitik enters the picture, Rome is, as the French would say, Rome is far away.
But at least as a facade, as incorporated into rituals and rites and whatever, the theater of the state, the divine authority is crucial to the rise of the early modern state.
Again, it depends where. Right? In France, yes, absolutely. The emperor's not so much.
Yes.
Do you think that by the church, proclaiming things such as the Dominican orders was an attempt at reshaping, society from a more cultural approach than necessarily top-down?
Yeah, so so the orders are really interesting. So the Dominicans become notorious for entering universities and asserting their rights as masters. They want to teach the universities, and the universities want to kick them out. But they're seen as kind of the attack dogs of the papacy, right? The big ones, of course, are the Jesuits, right? I mean, that is part of the Counter-Reformation. That's the whole story of a massive attempt to counter Protestant, the Protestant emphasis on literacy, the Protestant emphasis on teaching and education, with sort of a very different Catholic, Orthodox Catholic version thereof. So I think the Mendicant orders aren't seen by the medieval papacy as being, they're seen as a useful irritant against temporal rulers, right? But they're nowhere near as powerful or as culturally significant as the Jesuits become. Never mind in Latin America, where that's a whole different story. But that's kind of later. I think that's later rather than.
Well, I'll take the bait on the Latin America question, and I was curious about how would you think about the influence of the church on state formation later on, which is what the role it might have in Latin America, in which state formation is happening much later. In the kind of emerging literature on state formation in Latin America, Sebastian Masuka spoke, for example, that the latecomer formation for states is just different from formation in the 1500s. So even though it's not a topic of the book, how would you think about what role the church might have had later on?
So I think the sources of emulation will be very, very different, right? If you're starting from scratch, or relative scratch, as the church did, you're likely to be, and you are so relatively more efficient, you're likely to have more influence as even a set of administrative templates. By the 1500s, and especially in the colonial era, those the states have already, or state institutions have been already shaped. There's no need to look to the church for those templates. They're either being exported as colonial institutions into the New World, or they're basically being sort of picked up and refashioned from other absolutist leaders. So absolutists pick up hints from each other, but it's a very different process because it no longer relies on sort of adopting from the church. Those set of templates are not only not the best game in town, they're also they're also much weaker at this time period. But I think there's emulation is an underexplored process of state formation.
That was one of the things I was supposed to point out. That was a highlight of the book and a contribution. I call it institutional memory, which you make reference to that term as well. But that's just something that is so ignored in political science, where there's everything is being rationally calculated. We're learning and something, and just copying an institutional form that seems to be working without the organic necessarily materials to put it together, or also with the conceptual framework to understand why this is working here. But it's in post-communist Eastern Europe, there was a lot of institutional mimicry, and now we look at those institutions and wonder what happened. And it's just, yeah.
Exactly.
I didn't know you were there.
Emily Turner.
Thank you so much for the talk. And just to go back to your comment a moment ago about kind of conceptual differentiation, but pragmatic or practical overlap. In the early church, it's the case that thinking about the ecclesiastical courts, the resentment that grows up when people are being tried in one versus the other. In the early church, it's interesting that there's a system of the bishops' courts, and the empire recognizes the verdicts of the bishops' courts. People who are not involved in cases necessarily involving the church or clerics can petition to have their cases removed to bishops' courts as long as they promise that they won't petition to have them moved back. Is that the case in the Middle Ages also? I'm just wondering about kind of the way this resentment grows up. If people have an option to remove to an ecclesiastical court, it seems like that would mitigate that to a certain degree, but I don't know if it comes up at all, whether or not it was an option in these medieval ecclesiastical courts to do that.
So it's an option depending on what develops is kind of a sort of criteria. If it's family law, if it's inheritance, if it's property, then it can go into the ecclesiastical court. That's where it belongs, in fact.
So it's subject matter.
It's subject matter, but those can be defined very expansively, right? I mean, my family owns a piece of property, and so I'm going to take this contract dispute into the church court. Yeah. So, and again, this is where the overlap, and this too much to the frustration of conceptual clarity.
Thank you.
Yes, Casey, first.
Hi. I want to follow the line you brought up on copying before. I study American politics and I study state legislatures and when they do and don't copy one another. And it's interesting because sometimes they copy a policy from another, it'll work. Sometimes they'll copy one, they'll customize it, it fails.
Yeah.
Are there any innovations or institutions from the church, practices from the church, that medieval states tried to copy that fell flat?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, there's some suggestions that the church made that totally fall flat, right? Like the election of rulers, no thanks. Anti-usury laws, totally not adopted. And there's the eternal struggle against adultery, right? Which to this day continues with absolutely no effect. As much as the church might care about this is just not an area where it had much influence. And, rulers don't want to pick up everything that the church is throwing at them. So they basically, they're very selective, or not very selective. The bishops were, basically pushing for things where they could actually see benefits to basically the rulers, not just so things that so there are several things that the church pushes for that the bishops don't really pick up because they view them as counterproductive in their twin role.
But the church in this period, or maybe beginning a little early, it does have an influence in monogamy.
Right. So this is
and particularly for rulers, you can have something on the side.
So this is the infamous church marriage family law program, right? There's a whole sort of arguments about the ways in which Europe goes from being governed by kinship to being governed by nuclear families, and the papacy basically limits whom you can marry. So you can no longer marry, for example, the widow of your brother. On adoptions are not allowed. So you don't have this familiar thing from Japanese courts where adults are adopted as heirs on the deathbed of the person who's going to be the adopter. You don't have that. There are limits on divorce. There are all kinds of limits, and one explanation is that these are all designed to make sure that fewer people can marry and have children, and if fewer people can marry and have children, then more resources will fall by default to the church, right? People die without heirs. People can't, transmit their property. So yes, absolutely, that made a difference. But there's also a reaction against it, right? So primogeniture is a reaction against this church marriage family program. Primogeniture is only the one son will inherit, right? Because rulers are now worried about their property being fragmented among several sons, and that increases the likelihood that the church might be able to pick up some of these properties because these sons won't have children of their own. So instead, the oldest son inherits everything, and that's a direct reaction to this church family program. So it works both ways, as everything in history always.
Well, yes, please.
You mentioned just now that bishops didn't always follow exactly what the Pope said.
Mhm.
To what degree was that allowed? Like, I didn't realize, I guess, that there was wiggle room in there. How?
Come on, you're in BC. You know that. Wow, John. No, so it's actually there's Rowan Doran has these absolutely amazing work on basically how the bishops, there's a papal bull. The bishops are supposed to transmit it to the rulers and to their dioceses. And do you know what they do? Editing errors. Whole sentences get left out. You can trace how all these dictates from the papacy get edited and reinterpreted, of course always favoring the bishop's own interests and sometimes the rulers along the way. And this is strictly forbidden, right? It's supposed to be the Pope's word. But that's just one example of the ways in which the bishops would sort of protect their own interests and the rulers against the papacy. And what is the papacy supposed to do? Check their results.
Mm-hmm. Intercept their homing pigeon. Right?
Exactly.
Well, I know you set out to shed light on what were called the Dark Ages. I know, and I think you illuminated us all on medieval history, and so I thank you for that. And I urge everyone to read the book and join me in thanking Anna Marcus.